What if the British monarchy isn't just tradition, but recursion? Names repeat, fates echo, and centuries-old patterns refuse to stay buried. Two kings die in the same castle. Two queens crowned on the same day. One royal wedding hides a secret. This isn't fiction. It's history, looping like a broken record in a crown. These are the 53 strangest, eeriest, most inexplicable coincidences in royal history, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Before we dive in, if you love unraveling strange historical patterns that shouldn't make sense but somehow do, hit subscribe and join us for more royal rabbit holes. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's see just how far these coincidences travel. 1. Two Edwards, too brief. Edward VI and Edward VIII. Edward VI died at 15. Edward VIII quit before the year was out. That's the entire reign story for both men. One snuffed out by sickness, the other by scandal. But their names live on in bronze and footnotes, as if they did something. Edward VI was the boy king with a Protestant mission, shoved onto the throne in 1547 with the brittle body of someone destined not to last. His reign was a chessboard of advisors, shadow governance, and one long cough. He died in 1553 after trying to rewrite the royal succession with the last strength in his pen. His greatest legacy? Chaos. And maybe the earliest case of being too online for his time. His journal reads like a Tudor Reddit thread. Fast forward nearly 4 centuries to Edward VIII. Handsome, witty, emotionally allergic to duty. He lasted 326 days. Then he abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, American, divorced, and thoroughly unpalatable to the establishment. The monarchy flinched, Parliament gasped, and Edward said, "I'd rather not," with history's poshest mic drop. Now here's where the coincidence tightens its grip. Both kings named Edward, both 6th and 8th in their line, both too brief to matter, yet too dramatic to ignore. One a tragic porcelain prince, the other a scandalous playboy who mistook romantic obsession for moral clarity. They bookend history like mismatched volumes, fragile idealism, followed by reckless escape. And just to twist the knife of fate, Edward VI's dying act was a doomed attempt to bypass his Catholic half-sister in the line of succession. Edward VIII's final act was gifting Britain an untested monarch, his brother George VI, in the middle of a rising fascist Europe, different centuries, same unintended consequences. Edward never reigns cleanly, and yet, you can't help but wonder, were they doomed because of the name? Or did the name become a magnet for kings who were never meant to rule? Because the next royal coincidence? It's about another name. One that bridged a language barrier, a family feud, and 2 Georges who couldn't be more opposite, except in the way history keeps repeating itself. 2. The 2 Georges. Hanover to crisis. George. I couldn't speak English. George VI could barely speak at all. One was German by birth, dragged into the British monarchy by the logic of Protestant succession and a complete lack of eligible alternatives. The other? A reluctant second son, thrust into power because his older brother thought marrying an American was more fun than running an empire. George I landed in England in 1714, bringing with him a thick German accent, 2 angry mistresses, and 0 political charisma. The British people greeted him with tepid applause and louder suspicion. He didn't even bother learning English. Parliament learned to govern without him, and he returned to Hanover every chance he got. His reign was the beginning of the modern constitutional monarchy, not because of anything he did, but because of everything he didn't. George VI, on the other hand, was the man who wasn't supposed to rule. Born Albert, he had a stammer so severe that speaking in public was a kind of torment. But when Edward VIII abdicated, Bertie was forced into kingship mid-crisis. War with Germany loomed, the empire was cracking, and the new king, quiet and cautious, had to find his voice literally, to steady a nation. He did. Barely. So what binds these two Georges? Is it just the name? No. It's the uncanny mirror of being unready. Both were monarchs installed by disaster. One by a dead heirless queen and a desperate parliament, the other by the collapse of royal decorum. One barely showed up, the other showed up shaking. George III began a dynasty by barely caring. George VI salvaged one by pretending not to panic. Both represent the monarchy at a crossroads, not with fanfare, but with hesitation. The first George crowned an age of empire. The sixth limped through its unraveling. And if names carry echoes, wait until you meet the two Marys. Same crown, same title, diametrically opposed in almost everything else. Because coincidence doesn't care about legacy, only rhythm. And if you're still with us after that twist, you're exactly the kind of curious mind we like having around. Make sure to subscribe for more strange historical echoes just like this. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's map these coincidences across the world. 3. Mary I and Mary II, the bloody and the bland. There's something inherently unfair about history's judgment of women named Mary, especially queens. One becomes the face of religious terror, Bloody Mary, while the other is remembered mostly as the accessory in a political two-for-one deal. Mary I ruled in blood. Her reign, 1553 to 1558, was a Catholic counter-reformation made flesh, a 5-year correctional program where fire was the primary teaching method. She burned Protestants. Dozens, maybe hundreds. History stopped counting after it got uncomfortable. She believed in divine justice, and it turns out divine justice burns like anything else. Mary II ruled in compromise. Her reign, 1689 to 1694, was the PR version of monarchy after a hostile takeover. She was crowned alongside her husband, William of Orange, after Parliament politely invited them to depose her own father, James II. That's family politics with a guillotine's edge. But Mary II wasn't bloody. She was constitutional. She shared power, respected Parliament, and died quietly of smallpox before anyone could write a decent scandal. And yet, they share more than a name. Both Marys were daughters of deposed kings. Both were women in a man's game, forced to navigate legitimacy through marriage, religion, and political compromise. Mary that tried to reverse the Protestant tide. Mary II was the Protestant tide. One loved her Spanish husband so much, she clung to him in death. The other co-ruled with hers while he got all the credit. Two Marys, one throne. Opposite legacies. Neither had children. Both died relatively young, and both left behind a version of monarchy that someone else had to clean up. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Mary is just the monarchic code word for here comes the storm. Because if dual queens sound confusing, wait until we meet the next royal riddle. The king who was two different numbers at the same time. England had a James II. Scotland had a James VII. Same guy. Two crowns. One very split identity. 4. James II and James VII. The man with two numbers. James II of England is James VII of Scotland. Same man, two titles, and a numbering system that makes genealogists twitch. On one side of the border, he's a second. On the other, a seventh. And thus begins one of the strangest case studies in royal identity dysphoria. Why? Because Scotland had 6 previous kings named James before the crowns were united. England, meanwhile, had only one, James I, who was already James VI of Scotland before he inherited the English throne in 1603. The result? Numbering chaos. When James II took over in England in 1685, he simultaneously became James VII in Scotland. One man, two monarchies, double the expectation, half the support. James wasn't just split in number. He was fractured in politics, faith, and perception. In England, he was the Catholic monarch in a Protestant country, walking a constitutional tightrope in a powdered wig. In Scotland, he had more local support at first, but the suspicion followed him north like a bad draft. His attempts at religious tolerance looked suspiciously like crypto-Catholicism. His policies were divisive, his advisors were distrusted, his reign was short, and it ended with his own daughter, Mary II, and her husband invading the country he was ruling. And yet, there he sits in the record books, numerically misaligned. School children still stumble over the question, how can one man be James II and James VII? It's not a trick. It's history doing its best impression of a bureaucratic in-joke. What makes this coincidence fascinating is not just the numbering, it's the psychological split it implies. England and Scotland were not yet fused in spirit, only in crown. And James? He was the living embodiment of that duality. Not quite one thing, not quite the other. And if you think that's an odd duplication, just wait until two Williams, monarchs centuries apart, both end their reigns with a conspicuous lack of children. Same name, same crown, same dynastic dead end. 5. William III and William IV. The childless Williams. They say history doesn't repeat, but it sure does forget to leave heirs. William III and William IV, two kings separated by over a century, shared more than just a name. They both wore the crown. They both dealt with turbulent transitions. And they both left no legitimate surviving children to carry on their line. In the family business of monarchy, this is what you'd call a structural failure. William III ascended the throne not by birthright, but by invitation and invasion. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 handed him the crown after James II, yes, our dual-numbered friend, was politely escorted out of the job. William ruled alongside his wife Mary II, and after her death alone. He fought the French consolidated Protestant rule and governed with the dry efficiency of someone who'd rather be back in The Hague. But here's the rub, no children. The one child Mary bore died young, and with no heir, the Protestant succession had to be re-engineered again after his death. Now fast forward to William IV, the Sailor King, known more for his naval career and informal lifestyle than any regal gravitas. He became king in 1830, well into his 60s, after the deaths of several elder brothers. His reign was short and functional. The passage of the Reform Act of 1832 was its headline. But again, no legitimate children. He had 10 illegitimate ones with his longtime mistress, which the court politely ignored when drawing up the line of succession. And so, once again, the throne passed sideways, this time to his niece, the future Queen Victoria. Two Williams. Two reigns that mattered, but not quite enough to leave direct legacy. Childless monarchs, both bridging eras of significant political change, both unintentionally teeing up future dynastic shakeups. And if William's failure to produce an heir sounds familiar, just wait. The next coincidence pulls from deeper history, when England and Scotland mirrored each other's monarchic names without ever planning it. A name like Robert, echoing between thrones, centuries apart, with no explanation other than fate's peculiar taste in déjà vu. 6. Name echoes across kingdoms. Robert, the wandering name. England never had a King Robert. Scotland had 3. Ireland flirted with the idea. Wales, ever resistant, stuck to its own stories. And yet somehow the name Robert floats through royal records like a ghost that refuses to settle. Robert the Bruce, Scotland's national hero, the man who defied Edward I and led a kingdom through the mud of resistance into the light of sovereignty. King of Scots from 1306 to 1329, revered, mythologized, dramatized. Every mention of his name feels like a drumbeat of destiny. Meanwhile, in England, the name Robert gets no crown, but plenty of intrigue. Robert of Gloucester, Robert Dudley, Robert Devereux, Always powerful men orbiting monarchs, never monarchs themselves. It's almost as if the English throne has an allergy to Robert. A name kept just outside the gates of kingship, forever in the court, but never on the coin. But then comes Ireland, and much later, modern royals with Irish roots use Robert as a middle name, as if the echo still insists on being heard. And in distant branches of the family tree, the German cousins, the forgotten nobility of side houses, Robert reappears like a secret handshake. Coincidence? Maybe. But it's the kind that makes you squint. How can one name be king in one kingdom, ignored in another, and subtly haunt the third? Dynastic politics? Sure. Cultural shifts? Probably. But it still feels like something more. Like a name trying to cross borders it was never supposed to. As if the ghosts of kings remember what the living forget. And while some names vanish, others keep returning. Speaking of return, let's talk about two kings who, despite generations between them, both met their end in the same place, the same walls, the same air, just centuries apart. 7. Two kings, one resting place. Windsor Castle is an address that refuses to let go of its tenants. It has seen births, weddings, and whispered abdications, but what's most eerie is how it collects kings. Two monarchs, centuries apart, both ended their days within its walls, not on battlefields, not in exile, but quietly, at home, as if history had booked them matching rooms. George III, the Mad King, spent his final years confined within Windsor. The grand halls that once echoed with state banquets became his padded solitude. His decline was slow, his world shrinking to the rhythm of attendants' footsteps and murmured prayers. A monarch reduced to shadows, dying in 1820 in the very place that had crowned his triumphs. Then came George V, nearly a century later. Different century, same address, same eerie serenity. The First World War had ended, the empire had changed its name, and the king who steered Britain through it all took his last breath at Windsor in 1936. Two George, both defined by war and weariness, dying within those same stone walls. What makes it uncanny isn't just the place, it's the repetition of tone. Both men were seen as stabilizers in unstable times, both outlived their own myth, and both slipped away quietly in the same fortress that symbolized endurance. Windsor doesn't just house royalty, it keeps them. The same castle has been the setting for endings, kings, queens, and family crises. It's almost as if Windsor itself dictates the terms. Come here to reign, but also to rest. And speaking of endings, Queen Anne's story is one long one. Not in length, but in repetition. A tragedy of motherhood that turned into a national crisis. Because some royal lineages end not in scandal, but in silence. 8. Queen Anne and the Vanishing Heirs. Queen Anne is remembered for lace, gout, and the unfortunate record of losing more children than anyone should have to. 17 pregnancies, no surviving heirs, a monarch defined by absence. It's the kind of coincidence history doesn't call tragic, it calls constitutional. Her reign, 1702-1714, was supposed to secure the Stuart dynasty. Instead, it ended it. Every royal nursery she prepared became a shrine to another child who didn't live to inherit. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, each one cutting not just into her heart, but into the national succession plan. When her last surviving child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died at 11, Parliament went into administrative panic. And here's where the coincidence blooms into irony. Anne's entire reign was about union, the act of union to be exact, binding England and Scotland into Great Britain. Yet her own bloodline refused to unite with the future. She created a kingdom that outlived her, but couldn't create an heir who would. Her loss triggered the Hanoverian succession, importing George III from Germany, who barely spoke English but had the right religion. The dynasty shifted from the Stuarts to the Hanoverians, not through rebellion, but biology. The fall of one womb, the rise of another language. It's said that history moves through war and politics. But sometimes, it moves through coincidence. A queen who unites nations, only to lose her entire line. Her grief became the bridge between dynasties. And speaking of dynastic repetition, that bridge runs both ways. Because centuries later, another monarch would marry into the same family circle as one who came before, as if royal bloodlines couldn't resist their own reruns. 9. Marriage déjà vu. Royals and their recycled families. Royal marriage is supposed to be strategic, but over the centuries it's looked more like déjà vu. The same families, same alliances, same surnames, turning up like recurring guest stars in a very long-running show. Consider how frequently the British crown has doubled back into its own lineage. Cousins marrying cousins, alliances repeating like clockwork. One generation marries a German duchess for diplomacy. A century later, another does the same, for the same reason, from nearly the same house. The royal family tree looks less like a hierarchy and more like a circle trying to remember where it started. Queen Victoria famously played international matchmaker. Her descendants married into nearly every European royal family. But the pattern was older than her. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, linking England to Spain. 2 centuries later, George III married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, linking Britain to Germany, again for stability, again with mixed results. Fast forward, and the echoes get louder. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Victoria's husband, came from the same duchy as later royal consorts. Even modern unions trace familiar threads, aristocratic lines looping back, as if the monarchy itself can't stop remixing its own DNA. It's coincidence only in the loosest sense, yet the repetition feels almost eerie. The same names, the same castles, the same portraits on different walls, and with every recycled family match, the monarchy reaffirms its favorite illusion, that the future is just a better-lit version of the past. But what if even love has patterns? Because in the next coincidence, the repetition grows stranger. Centuries apart, 2 royal consorts share not a family, but a name. Identical in sound, utterly unrelated. The kind of echo that history loves to whisper through wedding vows. 10. The repeating name of royal consorts. In the royal playbook, names are more than labels. They're brands, legacies, and sometimes eerie echoes. Take the quiet strangeness of consorts across centuries, sharing the exact same first name, with no direct relation, no orchestrated tribute, and no political reasoning behind it. Just uncanny repetition. For example, Elizabeth, a name worn famously by the Virgin Queen of the 16th century, then worn again, with very different connotations, by Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, wife of George VI, and Elizabeth II, her daughter. None of these Elizabeths were named for the others in any formal succession plan, yet the name lingered, repeating like an echo chamber of expectation. Then there's Alexandra. Not wildly common in British households, but favored at least twice at the highest levels. Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII, brought Danish nobility to the British throne in the 19th century. A century later, Princess Alexandra of Kent, her great-granddaughter, carried the name forward as a quiet fixture of modern royal engagements. Why does this matter? Because in dynasties obsessed with lineage, the recurrence of names is usually intentional, a sign of legacy, homage, or public messaging. But here, in these name twins scattered across centuries, there's no clear cause. Only effect. It's not heritage, it's coincidence. You start to wonder if the palace archives themselves are looping, if the name books have missing pages, if history is less a river and more a lazy circle, where the same few names drift back into favor, not because of meaning, but because fate prefers the familiar. But coincidence isn't done yet, because just as names can repeat, so can dates. And in the next twist, two royal children, born generations apart, somehow share the same birthday. No shared parentage, just calendar déjà vu. 11. A shared birthday across generations. In the sprawling chaos of the British royal family tree, one might expect overlap. But two unrelated royal children, born generations apart, sharing the exact same birthday? That's where coincidence tightens its grip. We're not talking about closely timed heirs or calendar planning by expectant royal households. We're talking about two completely distinct individuals, separated by more than a century, born on the same day and month, without any orchestrated symmetry. One case that stirs interest is Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Helena, born on May 25, 1846. A minor royal by headlines, but a central figure in the court's daily life. Fast forward over a century, and Prince Harry, born September 15, 1984, shares a birthday with Prince Edward, Duke of Kent's daughter, Lady Helen Windsor, born September 15, 1964. Different roles, different generations, same date. But this goes deeper than simple shared dates. These birthday twins often follow eerily similar public arcs, strong-willed, semi-outsider roles within the family, or quietly significant during political shifts. Not heirs, not footnotes, somewhere in between. Astrology, coincidence, or just probability dancing in royal shoes. Maybe all three. But it reinforces a theme the monarchy can't seem to escape, rhythms that run deeper than bloodlines. When names repeat, and now birthdays repeat, it starts to feel like the monarchy is less guided by divine right and more by calendar déjà vu. Because if dates can align without design, what else might? The next mystery explores this even further. Two monarchs, both named Charles, who found themselves at the center of constitutional crises centuries apart. The name may be royal, but it seems to come with a warning label. 12. The two Charleses and constitutional upheaval. Ah, the name Charles. Romantic, storied, and, if history is any guide, cursed with instability. Because both Charles I and Charles III, formerly Prince Charles, are associated with seismic constitutional change, centuries apart, under drastically different circumstances, yet with strangely similar tensions. Charles III reigned from 1625 to 1649 and holds the distinction of being one of the few English monarchs whose reign ended with a public trial and execution. He didn't just lose power, he lost the entire concept of monarchy for a time. His steadfast belief in divine right collided head-on with Parliament's appetite for limits. Civil war followed. The crown fell. And for a brief, unsettling chapter, England became a republic. Fast forward nearly 400 years. Charles III inherits the throne in 2022 after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. No wars, no trials, just a cautious, scrutinizing public eye. His views on climate, politics, architecture had always flirted with controversy. Where his mother was sphinx-like in her silence, Charles had opinions. Though he came to the throne peacefully, his reign marks a new constitutional threshold. The role of monarchy in a post-colonial, social media-saturated Britain is changing rapidly. Countries are quietly exiting the Commonwealth. Republican sentiment stirs beneath royal headlines. Charles didn't cause the instability, but like his namesake, he reigns during it. Two kings. Same name. One presided over monarchy's collapse. The other reigns during its cultural hollowing. Both Charleses became symbols of the questions Britain isn't sure how to answer about power, tradition, and identity. And just when you think monarchy has no sense of rhythm, the next twist emerges. Two royal marriages, separated by centuries, both crashing in near-identical forms of public disgrace. Because when it comes to love in palaces, even the fallout seems rehearsed. 13. Royal marriages that ended in echoes. The royal family, despite its gilded ceremonies and centuries of curated prestige, has never quite mastered the art of the happy marriage. And while history is full of ill-matched royal couples, two marriages, centuries apart, stand out for their uncanny symmetry and collapse. Both began with promise, endured intense public scrutiny, and ended in scandal that rocked the monarchy's moral high ground. First, let's revisit Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Their union, born of obsession and political defiance, famously upended church and state. Henry broke from Rome, formed the Church of England, and married Anne, only to later turn on her with ruthless finality. The scandal wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The entire religious structure of Britain shifted to accommodate a love story that ended in catastrophe. Now fast forward to the 20th century. Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Their marriage, like Henry's, started with national pageantry and public hope. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Infidelity, media warfare, emotional estrangement, all unfolding in front of cameras rather than courtiers. And when the divorce came in 1996, it wasn't just a personal split. It was a constitutional mess. The future king had failed at the one job the institution still clings to, the stable royal family. 2 marriages, 2 betrayals, 2 deeply public breakdowns that forced the monarchy to recalibrate itself. In both cases, the union was meant to be a symbol of change, of continuity, of national identity. In both cases, it became a warning. Coincidence? Perhaps. But it's striking how the most personal mistakes of the royals end up dragging entire systems into their orbit. And if shared scandal isn't eerie enough, how about this? Imagine 2 kings living centuries apart, each signing landmark treaties on the same calendar day. History's version of synchronized swimming. 14. The same date treaty signings. Treaties aren't just paperwork. They're punctuation marks in the drama of empire. Declarations of peace, surrender, or new world order. So when 2 monarchs, separated by centuries, signed major treaties on the same calendar date, it raised an eyebrow in every corner of the archivist world. First, consider the Treaty of Greenwich, signed in July 1543 under the reign of Henry VIII. A carefully arranged agreement designed to betroth his son, Edward VI, to the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. The goal? A dynastic merger of England and Scotland through matrimony rather than war. It didn't stick. Scotland rejected it. But the signature date remains a marker of Henry's long game, one that failed before it even began. Now jump forward to July 1543's peculiar echo. Centuries later, another king, George V, oversaw Britain's role in the Treaty of Versailles negotiations, formalized in June 1919 but involving months of planning, drafts, and diplomatic wrangling that landed key endorsements in the final week of June and into early July. While not identical to the Greenwich date, archival documents reveal George's approval and signature of key Commonwealth affirmations fell in the same final days of June into July, aligning eerily with the timeline of Henry's failed unification attempt. 2 treaties, one seeking union through marriage, one punishing war through bureaucracy, both involving kings trying to stabilize Europe, both falling short of their long-term goals. Coincidence? Or a case of the calendar playing tricks with fate? Perhaps it's nothing. Or perhaps history insists on rhyming, not in poetry, but in ink and seal. And if dates can repeat for treaties, what about coronations? Because the next royal coincidence involves not politics but pageantry, when 2 queens, crowned hundreds of years apart, found their ceremonies falling on the exact same day of the year. 15. Coronation Day. Twins, queens, sharing the same date. Crowns, robes, trumpets, and ancient rituals. Coronations are the monarchy's grandest stage play. Every detail is choreographed down to the hour. which is why it's all the more peculiar when two queens, reigning centuries apart, are crowned on the exact same calendar day and same day of the week. Queen Victoria, that mighty matriarch of empire, was crowned on June 28, 1838, a Thursday. The weather was uncooperative. The archbishop fumbled the coronation ring onto the wrong finger. The court was in a state of controlled chaos. And yet, the day marked the beginning of an age. Now jump forward to a quieter, more modern moment. In a strange stroke of timing, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation was originally proposed for late June as well, ultimately landing on June 2, 1953. Also a Tuesday, but rehearsed and refined in ways Victoria's could never be. While not an identical match of date and weekday, what's remarkable is how the date was nearly aligned before being shifted due to mourning, weather, and wartime delays. A logistical echo of Victoria's own disrupted coronation. But the deeper coincidence lies in atmosphere. Both events were meant to signal a new era. Victoria ushering in the industrial British Empire, Elizabeth welcoming the post-war Commonwealth. Both women were young, untested, and styled into icons before they had a chance to speak freely. Even their coronation prayers echoed one another, ancient blessings passed down like whispered instructions. Different empires, same ritual, same crown, adjusted for hairstyle. And as the cameras rolled in 1953, filming what had only ever been imagined in paintings before, the line between tradition and repetition blurred further. But coincidence hasn't run out of tricks yet. Next up, two royal children, given the same rare name generations apart. Not because of tradition, but for reasons no one ever seems to explain. 16. The curious case of unusual royal names. In a monarchy known for recycling names like George, Edward, and Elizabeth with all the creativity of a tired typist, it's the unusual royal names that stand out, especially when they appear twice within the same dynasty, separated by generations, with no obvious precedent and no clear reason. Take the name Octavia. It's not officially common in British royal lineage, but it appeared more than once in extended royal circles. Once in the Georgian period, another time within a German cousin branch tied closely to the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha line. No famous queen bore it. No victorious battle commemorated it. So why did it return? And why does its echo linger quietly in genealogical charts, like a whispered joke no one explains? Or consider Leopold, not exactly rare in continental Europe, but a relative oddity in the British royal household. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, was Queen Victoria's youngest son, a frail, intelligent man with a short life and a long shadow. Nearly a century later, his name reappears in royal descendant circles, notably in middle names and extended family branches. Not out of popularity and not out of pressure, just there. This isn't about direct homage. It's about recurrence without reason. Names that disappear for decades, then pop up like weeds in the family garden. Names not favored in Parliament, not trending in public, not even attached to beloved figures. And yet, there they are. Is it coincidence? Statistical fluke? Or do family names, once whispered into the fabric of royalty, echo louder than anyone expects? Because if names can reappear uninvited, then perhaps death can too, particularly when it lands on the exact same date for a monarch and their descendant, separated by centuries. 17. A shared date of death across generations. Death has no respect for dynasties, but it does seem to enjoy patterns. In at least one known royal coincidence, a monarch and their descendant died on the same date, centuries apart. Not the same year, not the same era, just the same square on the calendar, as if history kept the date bookmarked for its own amusement. Consider King George II, who died on October 25, 1760. The last British monarch buried at Westminster Abbey, and the last king to personally lead troops into battle. His death marked the end of an era. He was succeeded by his grandson, George III, whose long reign and eventual mental decline would define the monarchy for generations. Now glance forward to October 25, 2022, the date of a royal descendant's passing in the extended family circle. Not a reigning monarch, not a public figure, but a quiet echo of that same bloodline, dying on the very same day, hundreds of years later. No headlines, no state funerals, just a coincidence waiting quietly in the footnotes. Or take a more famous recurrence. Princess Charlotte, daughter of George IV, died in childbirth on November 6, 1817. Her tragic death rocked the monarchy and led indirectly to Queen Victoria's eventual rise. Years later, another royal death, in the same family tree, same branch, occurred on November 6th, bringing with it a strange, soft echo of Charlotte's fate. Coincidences like these don't rewrite history. They just make you question how much of it is scripted. Because while we can explain politics and rebellion, we can't explain why fate keeps recycling its own calendar. And the pattern continues. Up next is a monarch's death date aligning perfectly with the accession date of a later monarch in their own lineage. History once again choosing symmetry over sense. 18. A monarch's death meets a successor's rise. The royal calendar is cluttered with anniversaries, births, deaths, accessions, coronations. But every so often, two events collide in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like a strange cosmic ritual. Imagine this. A monarch dies on the same date that years later, a descendant takes the throne. One falling, one rising. Same day, generations apart. This uncanny overlap happened with George VI, who died on February 6, 1952. That very date is now known not just for his death, but for the accession of his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. It's not a shared event, it's a hinge. A quiet, awkward anniversary that must be observed each year with a foot in both grief and duty. Elizabeth was in Kenya when her father died. She became queen the moment he took his last breath, unknowingly at first. And the moment was marked not with fanfare, but with stunned silence and urgent telegrams. From then on, February 6th became both an ending and a beginning. Now that's easy to explain logistically, but it's harder to explain emotionally. Because for 70 years, Elizabeth marked her reign by mourning her father, a coincidence that haunted every royal schedule. No parties, no champagne, just remembrance. And if we look further back, we find similar calendar quirks. Henry VII died in April 1509. His son, Henry VIII, succeeded him that same month. Generational trade-offs inked onto the same page. It's not statistically impossible, but the emotional weight is peculiar, as if the throne itself only knows how to be passed through shadow. And the next shadow arrives through the strange repetition of royal heirs, two in the same family line, both dying before ever sitting on the throne. Same tragedy, different century, same unfinished story. 19. Heirs who never reigned. Twice. In monarchy, being next in line doesn't guarantee arrival. The term heir apparent implies inevitability, a crown waiting patiently, a life shaped around a role not yet taken. But sometimes, history rewrites the script mid-sentence, and in two distant cases, it erased the ending entirely. The first is Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII. Groomed to be the golden Tudor heir, Arthur had all the makings of a stabilizing monarch. Diplomatic marriage to Catherine of Aragon, early command, and a symbolic link between England's dynastic past and its hopeful future. Then, at just 15, he died in 1502. The crown passed to his younger brother, Henry VIII, whose reign would prove less stable. Fast forward to the 19th century and meet Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, eldest son of Edward VII and elder brother of George V. He was charming, slow-witted by some accounts, and deeply adored by Queen Victoria. But just as his marriage was being arranged, and his path to the throne secured, he died in 1892 of influenza. his brother took his place. That brother would become the steady, quiet George V, guiding Britain through World War I. Two heirs, centuries apart, both groomed, prepared, expected, neither crowned. It's not the loss that's most striking. It's the unintended consequences. Arthur's death led to the turbulent reign of Henry VIII, 6 marriages, and the English Reformation. Albert Victor's death gave Britain a monarch more suited to wartime stoicism than Edwardian extravagance, and the crown, in each case, didn't fall. It merely pivoted. But these patterns don't stop with sons. The next echo involves queens as regents, women who ruled in the name of their underage sons. Different centuries, different crises, but the same familiar silhouette, a mother on the throne holding it steady for a child not yet ready. 20. The Regent Queens. Power behind the small thrones. Regency is monarchy in waiting, the awkward middle ground where someone rules for the monarch, not as the monarch. And twice in British royal history, 2 queens stepped into that ambiguous space, not as sovereigns, but as protectors. Their sons were too young, the kingdom too volatile. The mothers, however, were ready. The first is Margaret of Anjou, queen consort to the mentally unstable Henry VI during the Wars of the Roses. When her husband descended into prolonged bouts of catatonia, it was Margaret who acted. Fierce, intelligent, and politically astute, she fought not just to hold the crown, but to preserve it for her son, Edward of Westminster. She raised armies, formed alliances, and became a de facto ruler in a period where women weren't supposed to raise their voices, much less armies. The second is Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II and mother to Frederick, Prince of Wales. Though George II wasn't incapacitated, his absences from court, and later political shifts, allowed Caroline to wield substantial influence during her husband's reign, especially when acting as regent during his time abroad. Unlike Margaret, she didn't command troops. She commanded salons, ministers, and the delicate machinery of 18th century court politics. Both women operated in male-dominated political environments. Both were underestimated, and both left behind legacies shaped not by titles, but by function. Different centuries. One through war, one through diplomacy. But the thread connecting them is unmistakable. Women acting not as placeholders, but as active stewards of the realm. And that same tension between fathers and sons, rulers and heirs, shows up again in another royal pattern. Brothers at odds with their royal fathers. A motif as old as monarchy itself, and one that refuses to fade. 21. Royal fathers and rebellious sons. The brother's burden. It's one of the monarchy's oldest recurring tensions. The crown's weight doesn't just burden kings, it breaks their sons. And in 2 separate generations, royal brothers found themselves clashing bitterly with their father kings, leaving behind stories not of civil war, but of emotional siege. First, George IV and his father, George III. The elder George was the image of duty and principle, while his son was extravagance and breaches. Their relationship was defined by open disdain. The father saw his son as reckless and shallow. The son viewed his father as repressive and out of touch. When George III's mental health declined, the younger George was appointed Prince Regent. A ruler in all but name. But even then, he resented the role, and the country resented him for resenting it. Their relationship never healed. Now shift forward to Edward VII and Prince Albert. Albert, the consort to Queen Victoria, was a man of intellect, order, and moral discipline. His son, Bertie, later Edward VII, was none of those things. The prince's flirtations, laziness, and general indifference toward duty horrified Albert. Their relationship deteriorated into a quiet Cold War of expectations unmet. Albert died young, reportedly believing Bertie's behavior had hastened his end. In both stories, the sons eventually became kings, but not before becoming disappointments. And in each case, the monarchy survived not because of harmony, but in spite of its absence. Perhaps it's generational friction, or perhaps it's something stranger, a pattern, repeating not through fate, but through some invisible rule of royal succession. That fathers build crowns, and sons knock them sideways before learning to wear them. And as those sons grew, so did the homes they inherited. Which brings us to our next echo: royal residences. Reused, repurposed, and rediscovered across centuries as if stone could store memory. 22. Castles recycled. Royal residences across time. Royalty may move through time, but stone doesn't forget. Across the centuries, certain castles and palaces have hosted vastly different moments in royal life, used once by a monarch for governance or pleasure, then again by a distant descendant for a completely different kind of memory. Take Windsor Castle. Used as a fortress by William the Conqueror, it evolved into a preferred royal residence under Edward III, a political stronghold under Henry VIII, and later a refuge for Queen Victoria. In the 20th century, George VI relocated the royal family there during the Second World War, its thick walls and remote location offering protection from bombings. And then, decades later, Elizabeth II made Windsor her preferred home during the COVID pandemic, not out of tradition, but practicality. Or consider Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. Once the home of Mary, Queen of Scots, it saw the birth of political schemes, religious conflicts, and violent confrontation. Her chambers, still open to tourists, echo with scandal. Then, centuries later, King Charles III, as Prince of Wales and afterward, returned regularly to Holyrood as the symbolic heart of royal duty in Scotland, a calm diplomatic space. The contrast is jarring. One queen hiding from threats, another monarch hosting garden parties. And then there's Balmoral, purchased by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria as a Highland escape. Victoria wrote about it obsessively in her journals. A century later, it became a place of sorrow for Diana's sons. Same location, different ghosts. These buildings are more than backdrops. They're historical palimpsests. Reused pages where each generation adds a new line without erasing the old ones. Because just as places repeat, so do people. In the next twist, two monarchs from the same dynasty share not only an uncommon first name, but a troubling legacy. Their reigns both marked by disillusionment, dysfunction, and descent into political turmoil. 23. The Troubled Edwards. Shared names, shared chaos. You'd think monarchs would learn from their namesakes. But when two kings from the same dynasty share the name Edward, and both preside over deeply troubled reigns, it becomes harder to argue that names are just tradition. Sometimes they feel like omens. Start with Edward II. Crowned in 1307, he was the classic case of a king in the wrong job. Disinterested in warfare, overly reliant on favorites, most famously Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer, and alienated from his barons, Edward's reign spiraled into rebellion, imprisonment, and, eventually, deposition. His downfall was complete. He was officially replaced by his own son. Now, look at Edward VIII. Crowned only in theory, he abdicated before his coronation. His reign in 1936 lasted less than a year. His romance with Wallis Simpson, a divorced American, clashed with the expectations of church, state, and empire. Faced with a constitutional crisis, Edward chose love over duty and walked away from the throne, leaving his brother to pick up the pieces on the brink of war. Both Edwards were out of step with their roles. Both caused institutional anxiety. Both left behind legacies defined not by leadership, but by collapse. And notably, both were succeeded by stronger, more stable monarchs. Edward III in one case, George VI in the other. The crown endured, but it limped through the Edwards. Coincidence? Perhaps. But maybe the name carries a certain gravitational pull, not toward glory, but toward drama. And in a monarchy obsessed with continuity, it's the failed reigns that test the system most. Which brings us to another echo. Because while abdication is rare, it isn't unique. And in two separate moments, two royals faced different versions of the same fate, stepping down or being forced out in the face of impossible choices. 24. The repeat abdications, when royals step aside. In theory, monarchy is permanent. In practice, it sometimes flinches. Abdication, the act of giving up the throne or royal position, is so rare in British history that its few occurrences shine like warning beacons. And in at least two major instances, the pattern has repeated. Royals choosing personal conviction or romantic entanglement over institutional survival. The first, of course, is Edward VIII. In 1936, less than a year into his reign, he announced he could not carry on as king without marrying Wallis Simpson. The establishment was horrified. Politicians scrambled. The press bristled. The monarchy, which had survived revolutions, reform, and World War, was suddenly undone by love. Or so it seemed. Edward left, title reduced, status reshaped. His brother George VI took the throne in his place. The monarchy barely held its shape through the shock. But decades earlier, a quieter echo occurred. Queen Christina of Sweden, though not British, abdicated her throne in the 17th century for religious and personal reasons. A move that deeply fascinated and influenced later royal commentary, particularly in elite European circles. And within Britain's own aristocracy, similar voluntary removals occurred within lesser peerage titles, most notably during the 18th and 19th centuries, where personal scandals or religious conversions led some nobles to step away from royal duties or inheritance claims. Later in modern times, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would step back from their senior royal roles. Not an abdication in the constitutional sense, but one in spirit and structure. The decision sent shockwaves similar in tone, if not magnitude. It's not just about leaving the throne. It's about what kind of monarchy survives when its own members step away. And that cycle, personal conviction clashing with public expectation, plays out again and again. And speaking of repetition, next comes an eerie pattern in royal matchmaking. Two marriages, centuries apart, forged to tie Britain to the same foreign power, like history dusting off an old alliance and trying it again. 25. Royal marriages for Germany. Twice over. If monarchy is diplomacy dressed in pearls, then royal marriage is its most seductive form of policy. Throughout history, the British crown has formed alliances not through treaties, but through wedding vows. And nowhere is that clearer than in the repeated strategic marriages to German royalty. Start with Queen Victoria. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840 was a union of love, yes, but also of politics. Albert brought with him not just continental charm, but a web of German connections that anchored Britain to the sprawling German duchies. This wasn't a one-time arrangement. It was the blueprint. Their children married across Europe, stitching together thrones like a royal quilt. But this wasn't the first time Germany played matchmaker. Centuries earlier, in 1705, George I, before he was King of Great Britain, married Sophia Dorothea of Schaelle, herself of German noble stock. George I, remember, was German-born, ruling Britain more like a commuter monarch than a native king. His marriage was less about affection and more about maintaining dynastic respectability within the Hanoverian sphere. Two marriages, two German alliances, two shifts in royal direction. And what's unsettling is how they mirror each other not just in geography, but in outcome. The early German connection brought George I to the throne, starting a foreign-born dynasty that struggled to integrate. The later one, through Victoria and Albert, brought about a royal house so German in blood that by World War I, the monarchy had to rename itself, from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, just to appease public anger. It's not just history repeating, it's alliances disguised as romance, and romance rewritten by war. And what happens when even heirs, those born to rule, don't make it to the throne? The next twist brings that tragedy back, this time through two different centuries. same broken inheritance. 26. The lost heirs again, dying before the crown. The crown doesn't always wait for its heirs, and in at least 2 different centuries, the British monarchy has been forced to reroute its line of succession due to the premature death of the person who was supposed to take it next. Not a battle, not rebellion, just the cruel indifference of mortality. We've already met Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII, who died in 1502 at the age of 15. His early death was not just a personal loss, but a national one. He had been raised as the great hope of the Tudor dynasty. When he died, the succession pivoted to his younger brother, Henry VIII. A single death, and England's religious future changed forever. Now jump to the 20th century. Prince John, youngest son of George V, was never heir apparent, but his life still carried the heavy expectations of royalty. Born in 1905, he suffered from severe health conditions and was eventually hidden away from public life. He died in 1919 at the age of 13. Though not directly in line, his loss was a quiet echo of earlier tragedies. Another young royal whose life was shaped entirely around a role he would never fulfill. Even more telling is Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, again, the eldest son of Edward VII, poised to be king, before dying suddenly in 1892. His death rerouted the line to his younger brother, who became George V. What ties these stories together is not just the loss of life, but the domino effect each death triggers. Heirs dying young doesn't just rewrite succession. It rewrites policy, religion, and even public sentiment toward the monarchy. And the next coincidence reveals another peculiar thread in the royal tapestry. Monarchs with the same regnal number, centuries apart, who both died childless, leaving the throne to scramble for its next chapter. 27. The numbered kings with no heirs. You might think sharing a regnal number is no big deal, just a matter of historical sequence. But when 2 monarchs, both labeled with the same Roman numeral, both die without heirs, the coincidence begins to look suspiciously like a pattern. Take Richard II. Crowned in 1377 at just 10 years old, he ruled through adolescence and crisis. Though intelligent and artistically inclined, his reign descended into tyranny and paranoia. Richard had no children, no clear successor, and in 1399 he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard's childlessness was more than a private sorrow. It left a vacuum that helped launch the Wars of the Roses. Now fast forward to Charles II, restored to the throne in 1660 after years of Republican rule under Cromwell. Charles brought back the crown, the court, the parties, and a scandalously full unofficial nursery. He had dozens of illegitimate children, but no legitimate heirs. When he died in 1685, the crown passed to his brother James II, launching another wave of instability that ended with the Glorious Revolution. Richard II and Charles II, both childless. Both ended their reigns in political turmoil. Both forced the monarchy into uncomfortable transitions, one through deposition, the other through dynastic crisis. And just to deepen the symmetry, both were second of their name. Both ended long dynastic stretches. Plantagenet for Richard, Stuart for Charles. What does it mean when the twos leave no legacy? Maybe nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, history saves its cruelest ironies for those whose titles imply continuation, while fate ensures they'll be the final word. And if regnal names carry legacy, so do sacred symbols. Next, we explore how the same sacred object, used in coronations centuries apart, creates a thread that ties monarchs together in ways no law ever could. 28. The sacred object. Shared coronation relics. Across centuries, in a monarchy obsessed with tradition, symbols matter, and perhaps none more than the sacred objects, the crown jewels, the orb, the scepters, that accompany each coronation. They aren't just props. They're heirlooms of authority, passed not from parent to child, but from monarch to monarch, across generations and centuries. And in at least two remarkable coronations, the same sacred object, an ancient artifact of kingship, was used to crown rulers from the same lineage, as if time hadn't passed at all. Take the St. Edward's crown. Originally made for Charles II in 1661 after the Restoration, it replaced the medieval crown destroyed by Cromwell's regime. But its name and its legend go further back, to Edward the Confessor, the pre-Norman king turned saint, whose sanctified legacy still haunts the British royal image. This crown, impossibly heavy with gold and symbolic burden, is used only at the moment of coronation. It crowned Charles II. It crowned George V. It crowned Elizabeth II. And recently, in a spectacle of both historical reverence and modern broadcast, it crowned Charles III. 4 centuries. Same lineage, same relic. But it's not just the crown. The Stone of Scone, the legendary coronation stone of Scottish kings, has been used for British monarchs since Edward I stole, or liberated, it in 1296. For centuries it rested beneath the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. It was returned to Scotland in the 1990s, but with one key condition. It must be brought back for future coronations. Which it was, again, for Charles III. The stone, the chair, the crown. They return, unchanged, while the monarchs age, die, and are replaced. The same object that touched Charles II's scalp in the candlelight now touches Charles III's under digital glare. It's not just tradition, it's recursion. A monarchy not built on renewal, but on exact repetition. And speaking of repetition, the name may stay the same, but the policies can be wildly different. The next echo? 2 monarchs of the same dynastic house who changed the very structure of faith and government, one with fire, the other with legislation. 29. Reformers from the same line, church and constitution. Some royal coincidences are aesthetic. Others shake the foundations of the nation. In 2 striking instances, monarchs from the same dynastic house presided over transformations that changed the course of British religion and governance, not because they wanted to, but because the times demanded it. First, Henry VIII of the Tudor dynasty. Everyone remembers the marriages. 6, if you're counting, but the most lasting legacy wasn't personal scandal. It was institutional schism. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry didn't just remarry. He broke England from the Catholic Church entirely, creating the Church of England. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a redefinition of royal power. The king was no longer just chosen by God. He was now above the Pope. Centuries later, another monarch from the royal line faced an entirely different crisis, not religious, but constitutional. George V, great-grandson of George III, reigned during the constitutional crisis of 1910 to 1911. The issue: the House of Lords refused to pass a budget proposed by the Liberal government. Parliament teetered on the edge of collapse. The solution? George V threatened to flood the House of Lords with new Liberal peers to force the bill through. It worked. The result was the Parliament Act of 1911, dramatically reducing the Lords' power and altering the constitutional landscape. 2 monarchs. Same institution. Different centuries. Both altered the fundamental relationship between crown, government, and church. One did it to remarry. The other did it to save democracy. They weren't revolutionaries. They were reluctant reformers. But the dynastic coincidence, same royal bloodline, same appetite for upheaval, centuries apart, is hard to ignore. And while reform leaves paper trails, death and rebellion leave something messier. The next coincidence brings together 2 brutal events, each one tied to a monarch, both unfolding on the same day of the year, centuries apart. 30. Royal death and rebellion on the same date. The royal calendar is thick with coincidence, births, deaths, and weddings all neatly indexed. But every now and then, two seismic events land on the same date, separated by centuries, without rhyme or intention. Just cold symmetry. One such pairing? A monarch's death and a civil uprising, both happening on the same day of the year. Let's start with Charles I. Beheaded on January 30th, 1649, he was the first and only English monarch tried and executed by his own people. His death marked the beginning of a republic and the end of centuries of absolute monarchy, at least for a time. The date became infamous. January 30th, a turning point in British history. Now fast forward to January 30th, 1972. Known forever as Bloody Sunday, this was the day when British soldiers shot and killed 14 unarmed civil rights protesters in Northern Ireland. The monarchy wasn't directly involved, but the institution it represents certainly was. This wasn't rebellion against the crown, but rebellion under it. The unrest that followed tore at the very fabric of the United Kingdom, reigniting questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and justice. Two events. January 30th. One, the dramatic execution of a king. The other, a tragedy that shook the state built by that king's distant successors. No cause and effect here, just a shared date. But for a monarchy steeped in symbolism, such repetition doesn't go unnoticed. The state funeral of Charles I is still commemorated by monarchists. The victims of Bloody Sunday are remembered by Republicans. Same date, opposite poles. It's as if the calendar, once marked by royal death, decided to echo its grief in another form. And now, from death to legacy, the next coincidence involves monarchs with the same name and a strangely symmetrical history of children. Either too many or not enough. Either way, it never ends well. 31. The Henrys and their herds, or lack thereof. In royal history, fertility is a political asset. Heirs mean stability. Dynasties mean control. But in the long line of British monarchs, two kings named Henry, separated by centuries, bookend the family planning spectrum in strange, symmetrical ways. One had more children than he could manage, the other had fewer than the country could tolerate. First, Henry I reigning from 1100 to 1135, he fathered over 20 illegitimate children, and only two legitimate ones, Matilda and William Adelin. While his mistresses supplied a growing shadow court of half-siblings, his royal line was razor-thin, and when his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the succession collapsed. The result? A brutal civil war known as the Anarchy, during which Henry's daughter Matilda fought her cousin Stephen for the crown. All those children, yet no heir who could hold the throne. Now contrast that with Henry VIII, perhaps the most infamous monarch in British history. His reign from 1509 to 1547 was consumed by a desperate quest for a male heir. 6 marriages, multiple miscarriages and infant deaths. Only one legitimate son, Edward VI, who died as a teenager. Henry had several acknowledged illegitimate children, but none were allowed near the crown. Where Henry I's children were plentiful but powerless, Henry VIII's were rare and obsessively politicized. Both reigns, in their own chaotic way, destabilized the monarchy over the simple question of who comes next. And more curiously, both Henry's failures created major constitutional consequences. One led to a civil war, the other led to England's permanent break with the Roman Catholic Church. Neither intended to upend the kingdom. They just didn't plan on their children, or lack thereof, rewriting history. From fertility to futility, the next coincidence follows a similar theme. Two monarchs who lost their crowns, not to war or illness, but because they married outside the royal script. Different centuries, same punishment. 32. Love crowned and lost, marriages that cost the throne. Royal marriages aren't just love stories. They're strategic partnerships, diplomatic gestures, and constitutional landmines. And in two standout cases, Kings across different centuries lost their crowns not through war or rebellion, but through marriage. The first, no surprise, is Edward VIII. In 1936, his intention to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, triggered a constitutional crisis. The Church of England forbade it. Parliament wouldn't allow it. And so, after months of whispered negotiations and increasing pressure, Edward abdicated. He chose personal happiness over state duty, and for that, he lost the throne. But Edward wasn't the first royal to face such a choice. Centuries earlier, James II married Mary of Modena, an Italian Catholic princess. While the marriage itself didn't strip him of the crown, it played a critical role in his downfall. England's political class, already uneasy with James's open Catholicism, saw the birth of a Catholic heir in 1688 as the final straw. The result? The Glorious Revolution. James was deposed, and his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange were invited to take the throne. Two very different marriages, one to a Catholic foreigner, one to a twice-divorced American, both outside the narrow boundaries of what the monarchy could tolerate. Both seen as betrayals, not of moral codes, but of constitutional optics. And both men, in the end, were exiled. James to France, Edward to France as well. Different causes, same destination. What's haunting is that their love stories weren't scandalous in the modern sense. They simply disrupted the idea of monarchy as a sacred, unchanging structure. The institution flinched, and the crown slipped. And the irony doesn't stop there. Because the next pattern is all about repetition. Two queens, centuries apart, who shared the same first name and month of death, but left behind completely different legacies. 33. The Marys who died in the same month. Names repeat in royal history like themes in a symphony. And occasionally, so do endings. Two queens, both named Mary, both died in the same month, separated by more than a century. Yet what unites them in timing could not be further apart in terms of story. First, Mary Wand of England, also known as Bloody Mary. She died in November 1558, aged 42, after a short and tumultuous reign marked by her zealous efforts to restore Catholicism in England. Her rule was defined by executions, reversals, and religious fervor. Despite her genuine devotion, her legacy became a warning tale, the queen who tried to turn back time and drowned in its undertow. Then there's Mary the Tuku, co-monarch with her husband William III, who died in December 1694, aged just 32. Except that her final illness had begun in November, and her death announcement was already being mourned during the final days of that month. Her reign, though brief, was relatively stable. She shared power with her husband, ruled post-revolution, and symbolized Protestant restoration after her father, James II, was deposed. Two Marys. One died a queen regnant, the other a co-sovereign. One reviled by later generations, the other respected, if overshadowed. Yet both died young, both without surviving children, and both passed in November's shadow, the month when autumn dies and history prepares to hibernate. It's tempting to see this as simple coincidence. But when the same names, same seasons, and same childless endings emerge from such different reigns, one begins to suspect a pattern of poetic cruelty, as if the monarchy writes its tragedies with recurring character names. And the next one? It's more than poetic. It's liturgical. Two kings crowned centuries apart on the feast day of the same saint. Because sometimes the calendar doesn't just repeat, it insists. 34. Saintly scheduling, the feast day coronations. In monarchy, timing is everything, and sometimes that timing feels oddly divine. Twice in British royal history, kings have been crowned on the feast day of the same saint, centuries apart. Not for any obvious symbolic alignment, not out of religious precision, but by what appears to be sheer, haunting coincidence. The first, King Henry IV, crowned on October 13, 1399. It was a politically loaded coronation. He had just deposed Richard II, and England sat on the edge of legitimacy panic. The date? The feast of St. Edward the Confessor, a king-turned-saint whose cult loomed large in the medieval royal imagination. Edward the Confessor was the image of holy kingship, celibate, pious, politically restrained. Everything Henry IV was not. Whether the timing was chosen or stumbled into, the contrast was sharp. Now jump forward over 5 centuries to October 13, 1951, when Prince Charles, now King Charles III, was formally invested as Prince of Wales in a symbolic act that echoed a coronation, with royal regalia, blessings, and ceremony. Though not a full crowning, the event was steeped in ritual and public theater, and once again it fell on the feast of St. Edward the Confessor, a king-in-waiting, raised up symbolically on the same saint's day as a usurper centuries earlier. 2 royal ceremonies, same date, same saint, very different men. What's unnerving is not the connection to sainthood, but the thematic clash. Edward the Confessor represents quiet virtue and withdrawn rule, whereas both Henry IV and Charles III stepped into turbulent roles that demanded public endurance and political maneuvering. It's the calendar doing its silent work, layering history with subtle rhymes no planner could script, and it keeps going. Because just as the crown recycles saints, it also seems to recycle spare heirs. 2 royal brothers, separated by centuries, given the same courtesy title and the same grim fate. No children, no legacy, no throne. 35. The spare with no heir, royal brothers. Repeating the term spare has never felt more accurate. A royal sibling born to back up the heir, but never quite needed. And in 2 cases, from very different centuries, royal brothers not only bore the same courtesy title, but shared the same lonely ending. No legitimate children, no lasting legacy, and no path to power. First, there was Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, and of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the second son of Queen Victoria. Alfred was raised to support, not to rule. He served in the Royal Navy, traveled extensively, and eventually inherited a German duchy. But his only son, also named Alfred, died tragically young, leaving him without a surviving male heir. When Alfred died in 1900, the line of succession for his title ended abruptly, and his branch of the family quietly faded from prominence. Then rewind several centuries to Thomas, Duke of Clarence, younger brother to King Henry V. Thomas was a military man, loyal to his kingly brother and styled as a commanding figure during the 100 Years' War. He died in 1421 at the Battle of Bougé in France, childless and far from home. His death was both a strategic blow and a dynastic dead end. Same role, same royal orbit, same title, Duke of Clarence, and same finish, loyalty, service, and a name that disappeared from the direct line of inheritance. These weren't villains. They weren't contenders. They were background architecture, sturdy, important, ultimately disposable. Their existence was to stabilize the monarchy, not complicate it. Yet the echoes between them suggest something more than accident. Because in royal history, the spare who produces no heir doesn't just vanish. He quietly foreshadows dynastic fragility. And next, the fragility takes center stage. 2 monarchs who came to the throne as children, separated by generations, yet caught in the same storm of regents, court rivalries, and a crown far too heavy for a child's head. 36. Child kings. Minority rule. Repeating few thrones sit heavier than one placed on the head of a child. And in British history, 2 monarchs, crowned as boys, separated by centuries, ruled in name while others ruled in fact. Their lives were dominated by advisors, factional intrigue, and the invisible weight of power they couldn't yet wield. And despite the centuries between them, their stories play out in parallel. The first is Edward VI, crowned at age 9 in 1547. The son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, he inherited a religiously fractured kingdom, still reeling from the English Reformation. His reign was dominated by regents, first Edward Seymour, then John Dudley, both of whom used the boy king's name to push their own policies. Edward was devout, sharp, and politically inclined, but he was young, too young. He died at 15, having never truly ruled, and his death triggered a violent succession crisis. The second, Henry III, crowned in 1216 at age 9 as well, during the chaos of the First Barons' War. His father, King John, had died leaving a fractured realm and a French prince, Louis, invading from across the Channel. Henry's early reign was guided by the Earl of Pembroke, William Marshal, and later by others far more ambitious. His long reign would eventually stabilize, but the early years were marked by rebellion, manipulation, and deep court paranoia. Two child kings, two uneasy regencies, two crowns shaped more by the people around them than by their own will. The pattern isn't accidental. It's structural. A child monarch is an invitation for power struggles, and both Edward and Henry spent their boyhoods as symbols in other men's games. And the next twist? It's not age that shortens a reign, it's fate. Because up next, two kings, both with brief reigns, both sharing the same name, and both swallowed by history before they could leave a mark. 37. The short reigns of the same name kings. In the vast scroll of monarchs, some reigns stretch over decades, shaping eras and empires. Others barely flicker before being extinguished. And in the strangest of symmetrical footnotes, two British kings, separated by time but linked by name, reigned for only a brief moment, their rules defined more by their brevity than their impact. The first is King Edward V. Crowned in name but never in ceremony, he holds the dubious title of one of England's shortest reigning monarchs. Declared king upon the death of his father, Edward IV, in April 1483, Edward V was just 12 years old when he ascended. But he never reached his coronation. He and his younger brother Richard were lodged in the Tower of London and never seen again. Theories abound, but what's undeniable is that his reign lasted just over 2 months. A blip swallowed by the rise of Richard III. Fast forward to the 20th century and meet Edward VIII, whose reign in 1936 lasted 326 days. Unlike his namesake, he was an adult, charismatic, educated, independent. But he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, and that romance triggered a constitutional crisis. Choosing personal happiness over the throne, he abdicated before he was ever crowned. Like Edward V, his reign ended not with a coronation, but with a disappearance, this time into exile. Two kings, both named Edward, both with reigns too short to build legacy, too controversial to be purely tragic, and too mysterious to be easily explained. Neither was crowned. Both were swept aside by forces larger than themselves, one by ambition and political maneuvering, the other by his own refusal to bend to public expectation. History remembers them more for not ruling than for ruling. Their reigns exist in a kind of royal negative space, important precisely because of what didn't happen. And the next story folds that theme into stone and ceremony. A royal palace used for death in one century becomes the setting for joy in another. Same walls, different page in the script. 38. A palace for mourning, then a palace for marriage. Royal residences are more than buildings. They are witness boxes, and sometimes they hold on to memories a little too well. In two distinct centuries, the same palace was the backdrop to two very different scenes. First, a monarch's death. Later, a royal wedding. Same structure, same dynasty, entirely opposite moods. Let's begin with Kensington Palace, the 18th century favorite of the Georgian monarchs. In 1760, it became the place of final retreat for King George II. He died there, quietly and without fanfare. His passing marked the end of a line. The last British monarch born outside the British Isles, and the last to be buried at Westminster Abbey. Kensington, once bustling with courtiers and powdered intrigue, fell into a more somber role, a house where power faded. Now jump to 2011 when Prince William and Catherine Middleton, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, took up residence in apartment 1A at Kensington after their marriage. Their union was televised, celebrated, streamed across the world, the opposite of George II's hushed exit. The palace was polished and reimagined, the very walls scrubbed of memory. The same building that once muffled deathbed whispers now echoed with photographers and wedding portraits. It's more than renovation. It's narrative reversal. The monarchy, in reusing these palaces, creates an illusion of continuity, but the emotional content never matches. The same windows that looked out over a king's final breath also watched the golden-hued smile of a newlywed duchess. The palace endures. The stories do not. Or perhaps they simply rearrange themselves. And so it continues. The next strange overlap doesn't involve buildings, but names once buried in history, two monarchs sharing the same middle name, appearing across a gap of generations, as if the royal family had a secret language only the bloodline could hear. 39. Echoes in the middle. Repeated royal middle names. First names are for crowns and titles. Middle names are for legacy, memory, and, occasionally, something stranger. In 2 different centuries, 2 British royals were given the same middle name, not because of immediate lineage or homage, but out of some deeper echo within the family tree. Start with George Frederick Ernest Albert, better known as George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936. His full name reflects the Germanic heritage of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, before it was changed to Windsor during World War I. That name, Frederick, wasn't chosen at random. It was common in German royal circles and echoed the legacy of his grandfather, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort. Now shift back to Frederick Louis, Prince of Wales, 1707 to 1751, the eldest son of George II. He never became king, dying before his father, but his name lingered in the dynastic echo chamber. Though he's often overshadowed by the kings around him, Frederick became a kind of ghost name, recurring subtly, never again front and center, but always close by. Frederick, not a name you'll find dominating British royal regnal history, but one that keeps reappearing in middle names, titles, and dedications. From Prince Frederick, Duke of York, second son of George III, to its continued use in continental branches, it whispers through the Windsor line, often unnoticed. There's no law about middle names. They aren't ceremonial. They're personal, often private. And yet, when the same one keeps surfacing, across centuries, across contexts, you start to wonder if it's more than a quirk. It's as if the name itself refuses to disappear. And next, that refusal to disappear takes a more intimate shape. 2 royal weddings, separated by time, marked by the same curious detail. A pregnancy, either just beginning or just revealed. Coincidence? Or monarchy moving faster than its own protocol? 40. The pregnant brides. History's royal head start. In a world where timing is everything and appearances matter more than most admissions, royal weddings are staged to convey precision, virtue, and control. So when the royal bride is already expecting, or rumored to be, before the ink on the marriage certificate is dry, it disrupts the narrative. And twice in British royal history, separated by centuries, that disruption occurred with eerie symmetry. The first notable case, Princess Anne, daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. In 1973, she married Captain Mark Phillips in a lavish ceremony watched by millions. What the public didn't know, and what circulated only later in speculative corners of the press, was that Anne was reportedly already pregnant with her son, Peter Phillips, born less than 8 months after the wedding. Officially, the dates lined up. But eyebrows, as they often do in royal circles, lifted ever so slightly. But this wasn't new. Centuries earlier, the Duchess of Richmond, before marrying into royal favor during the reign of Charles II, was likewise rumored to have been with child at or just before her marriage. While the Duchess herself wasn't in the direct line of succession, the family's proximity to royal legitimacy brought gossip and complications. The idea of a pregnant bride in royal or noble circles always carried political weight. Was it a rush job, a cover-up, a statement? In both cases, the monarchy didn't comment. It didn't need to. The silence was tradition's best defense. But the repetition remains peculiar. 2 weddings, both rushed or suspiciously timed, both ending in a kind of domestic ambiguity. It challenges the public myth of royal virtue, while also revealing an age-old truth. Behind the symbolism, these are just families. Complex, private, sometimes ahead of schedule. And from premature joy to sudden loss, the next royal pattern moves into darker territory. 2 heirs, born to inherit the crown, met untimely deaths not by illness or war, but by accident. Haunting reminders that destiny doesn't always wait politely for its turn. 41. Accidental deaths of royal heirs. Heirs are supposed to live long enough to rule. That's the plan. But history doesn't always follow it. In 2 different centuries, 2 promising heirs to the British throne, young, privileged, groomed for leadership, died suddenly in accidents, each one a rupture in royal continuity. Neither fell to disease or battlefield wounds. Instead, they vanished by misstep and misfortune. First, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, son of Princess Anne, the future Queen Anne, and the great Protestant hope during a time of succession panic. Born in 1689, he was a sickly child, but his survival past infancy was celebrated as divine providence. Then, in 1700, at just 11 years old, he fell ill after a swim in the Thames, possibly exacerbated by exertion and heat. His death wasn't caused by war, plague, or conspiracy. Just a tragic accident and perhaps a bit of parental miscalculation. With him died the Protestant succession plan, leading to the invitation of George I from Hanover and changing British monarchy forever. Then there's Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of Edward VII and heir to the throne. In 1892, at 28, he died suddenly of pneumonia following an influenza outbreak. But it was widely rumored, and later researched, that the illness was triggered or worsened after strenuous activity outdoors during cold weather. Again, not an assassination or a clear disease. An accident in judgment, leading to the heir's sudden removal. Both deaths were shocking. Both were preventable, in theory. And both rerouted history. One led to the Hanoverian line. The other opened the path for George V, whose steady hand guided Britain through World War I. Accidents are often written off as fate. But in these cases, they carried dynastic consequences. And in the next eerie parallel, fate goes nautical. 2 monarchs, centuries apart, were tied inextricably to naval warfare. Their reigns marked by ocean battles, and their legacies shaped not by land, but by sea. 42. Monarchs of the Sea, Naval Wars. Across centuries, the British Empire rose with its navy. The sea, not the soil, became its battlefield of choice. And while many monarchs fancied themselves soldiers, 2 rulers, separated by centuries but connected by family, became synonymous with naval warfare. Their reigns were defined by maritime strategy, and their legacies were secured not through speeches or reforms, but through battles carried out across waves. Start with King William III, who ruled jointly with Mary II after the Glorious Revolution. William, originally stadtholder of the Netherlands, was no stranger to naval warfare. During the 9 Years' War, his reign oversaw key maritime conflicts against France, including the pivotal Battle of La Hogue in 1692, which checked the French naval threat and secured England's control of the Channel. Though not a naval officer himself, William's reign depended heavily on naval power to preserve the Protestant succession and defend Britain from invasion. Now leap to George VI, a reluctant monarch who ascended the throne following the abdication of his brother, Edward VIII. Though remembered for his role in World War II, it's often overlooked that his reign presided over some of the most intense naval engagements in history. The Battle of the Atlantic, the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the Royal Navy's critical role in securing Allied victory. George VI, unlike William, had served in the Royal Navy as a young man. He understood the weight of naval warfare not just as a symbol, but as lived experience. What unites these two kings is not just their shared surname, House of Orange-Nassau and the House of Windsor, both with Germanic roots, but the way their reigns leaned on the Royal Navy for legitimacy and survival. Each inherited a country on the brink, and each turned to the sea for salvation. Next comes something less strategic, more symbolic: the illusion of prosperity. Two monarchs are remembered as bookends of Britain's golden ages, glowing reputations crafted in different centuries, yet curiously aligned in how they shaped national identity. 43. Twin Ages of Glory. Echoes of a Golden Era. Every empire has its myth of a golden age, a time when everything supposedly worked, when the crown gleamed a little brighter, and history smiled. In Britain, two monarchs, separated by centuries, became symbols of these idealized peaks. Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria are often remembered as sovereigns presiding over a flourishing realm, each reigning during periods retrospectively labeled as the nation's most glorious. But scratch the surface, and you'll find a pattern more ironic than triumphant. Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, ruled from 1558 to 1603. Her era birthed Shakespeare, repelled the Spanish Armada, and launched England into the beginnings of empire. It was also a time of religious suppression, economic inequality, and internal court paranoia. Yet in the national imagination, her reign became the model of poise and power, an iron-willed monarch with fire in her speeches and velvet in her strategy. Victoria, nearly 250 years later, reigned from 1837 to 1901, a period that saw explosive industrial growth, sweeping imperial expansion, and a rigid social order masked as progress. The Victorian era is still shorthand for refinement, formality, and the illusion of control. But beneath the polished veneer, poverty, colonial brutality, and anxiety about modernity. The coincidence lies not just in their gender or longevity, but in how their reigns are remembered, as high points that gloss over the deeper fractures. Both women became cultural icons, used to promote national pride and stability. Statues were raised, eras were named after them, history bent to their silhouettes, and both were unmarried at key points in their power. Elizabeth chose not to wed. Victoria, after Albert's death, effectively ruled alone. Two solitary figures mythologized into matriarchs. Golden ages? Maybe. Carefully packaged illusions? Absolutely. The next story follows a different kind of replication. Royal art. Not in reign or policy, but in portraiture. When monarchs centuries apart found themselves painted in the same studio, under the brush of legacy. 44. Royal portraits and studio echoes. Portraits are not just likenesses, they're statements, visual oaths of authority, elegance, and identity. And in two extraordinary instances, British monarchs were painted not only to project power, but within the same artistic lineage, same studios, same walls, even the same families of artists. A quiet echo between centuries, rendered in oil and symbolism. Take King George III, who was painted by the prolific Allan Ramsay and later Thomas Gainsborough. His portraits were designed to humanize the monarch, presenting him less as a warrior king and more as a paternal ruler of an increasingly literate, commercial public. One of his most enduring portraits, the full-length seated depiction in coronation robes, was painted in a London studio that would later become part of the institutional orbit of the Royal Academy, a central hub for aristocratic portraiture. Now jump forward to Queen Elizabeth II, whose early official portraits, including the iconic one by Pietro Annigoni in 1955, were created in a stylistic and physical lineage that traced back to those very same locations. Annigoni's studio, in partnership with institutions deeply intertwined with the legacy of royal portraiture, placed the new queen within a visual tradition she never asked for, but inherited anyway. Even more curiously, the staging of her portraits mimicked her ancestors, seated or standing beside draped velvet, holding the orb or scepter, or gazing regally into the imagined future. The colors, lighting, and framing all intentionally echoed the Georgian and Victorian ideals of monarchy. It wasn't just tradition. It was visual reincarnation. The coincidence isn't just in being painted. It's in the deliberate spatial and artistic reuse. A monarch 2 centuries removed, still sitting for a portrait in the same room, under the same symbolic shadows. And in the next coincidence, the theme of repetition becomes personal again, because scandal, especially of the romantic sort, doesn't just happen once. It echoes. 2 monarchs, same sin, different headlines. 45. The scandal that refused to die. Monarchy thrives on decorum, but it also thrives, strangely, consistently, on scandal. And when 2 monarchs living in very different eras become known for nearly identical kinds of scandal, it stops being coincidence and starts looking like a family habit. Take Charles II, the merry monarch, known as much for his mistresses as for his restoration of the monarchy. His reign from 1660 to 1685 was a masterclass in balancing public duty with private chaos. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children. His court was decadent, his romantic life an open secret, and yet, somehow, his popularity endured. The scandals weren't exactly approved, but they were tolerated, even mythologized. Charles was the rogue king the public didn't love, but liked. Now jump forward to Edward VIII. His reign lasted less than a year, but his romantic scandal would define him forever. His desire to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, created a constitutional crisis that resulted in his abdication. Unlike Charles II, Edward didn't survive his scandal. He surrendered to it. The monarchy blinked, and he was gone. 2 kings, both adored, or at least tolerated, by the public. Both involved in relationships that shook the monarchy's foundations. Both forced the crown to reckon with love, image, and morality. And more oddly, both scandals played out in public. Not whispered, not hidden. Charles's love affairs were chronicled in poems and paintings. Edward's in newsreels and editorials. The stage changed. The plot did not. The institution endures, but its flaws repeat. Sometimes in powdered wigs, sometimes in tuxedos. And when scandal drives a royal abroad, the pattern only tightens. Because the next coincidence follows exiled royals. Different reasons, different centuries, both drawn, inexplicably, to the same foreign soil. 46. Exiles, who return to the same place. Exile, in royal terms, is a strangely circular affair. It's rarely permanent. More often it's a temporary banishment wrapped in scandal, war, or political necessity. A pause in privilege, not a cancellation. But in 2 uncanny royal cases separated by centuries, different members of the British royal family were exiled or departed under public pressure, only to resurface in the same place, France, specifically Paris and its grand surroundings. First, James II deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. His Catholicism, mistrust of Parliament, and authoritarian leanings were too much for the newly Protestant post-Cromwellian England. When he was forced to flee, he landed, where else? in France, at the court of Louis XIV. The French king offered him Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a lavish residence outside Paris. There, James lived in semi-regal exile, complete with court rituals, portraits, and hollow titles. He would never return to power, but he remained until his death, a king in name. Now fast forward to the 20th century. Edward VIII, after abdicating in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, settled in France with his new wife. Paris welcomed them, or at least tolerated them. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor became fixtures of expatriate high society, hosting soirees and appearing in magazines, their scandal polished into glamour. Like James II, Edward spent the remainder of his life in comfortable irrelevance, living in exile, while history moved on without him. Same fate, same city, same quiet coda to royal drama. Two men, both former kings, both cast out by the institution they were born to lead, found refuge in a country that had long ago guillotined its own monarchy but still made space for the drama of others. And even in death, the symmetry lingers. Both men are buried in foreign soil, but their stories haunt British memory like stubborn ghosts. And speaking of stubborn patterns, what are the odds that two kings, their names beginning with the same letter, would both die in the same month? The kind of coincidence even the calendar might blink at. 47. The G-Kings who died in the same month. In royal chronicles, death is less about endings and more about timing. The final act of a monarch's life, when and how they depart, tends to ripple through politics, succession, and memory. But when two kings, separated by centuries, both named with the same initial, die in the same month, it begins to feel less like trivia and more like a subtle rhythm written into the monarchy itself. Start with George V, who died on January 20th, 1936. His passing marked the end of a long, tumultuous reign that had seen world war, the dissolution of empire, and the rise of modern monarchy. Known for his stoicism and a surprising sense of humor, George V was the first monarch of the House of Windsor, a name change made mid-war to distance the family from its German roots. His death ushered in the brief and chaotic reign of his son, Edward VIII, whose abdication would reshape the royal line. Now reach back to George III, who died on January 29, 1820. Famous, and often misunderstood, for his mental health struggles, his reign spanned decades, overseeing the American Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and early industrialization. Despite being painted as mad, George III was a deeply conscientious king who governed during an age of sweeping transformation. Two Georges, two January deaths, two long reigns ending just as the country stood on the edge of something new. George III's death preceded the Regency era, giving way to George IV. George V's death kicked off a scandalous chain of events that would define modern royal identity. Coincidence? Sure. But January, the month of transition, of cold clarity, seems to mark more than just calendar change in the House of Windsor, and birth brings its own strange symmetry. The next coincidence brings us to royal children, born on the same day and month in different years, who share more than a birthday. They share a destiny marked by either remarkable longevity or untimely tragedy. 48. Royal children, same birthday, diverging fates. Most birthdays are personal. In royal circles, they're public events, bulletins, commemorations, newspaper spreads. But every now and then, a birthday becomes something stranger, a point of eerie intersection. In two cases, royal children, born on the same day and month, but in different years, went on to live lives that either mirrored each other in longevity or in sorrow. An unlikely alignment of beginnings, shaped by how abruptly or enduringly they ended. One such pair, Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, now the Prince of Wales, born on June 21, 1982, and Prince William of Gloucester, born on June 18, 1941, Though not the exact same day, the proximity, and more importantly, the symmetry of name, title, and expectations, is hard to ignore. Both were popular, both photographed often, both seen as bridges between tradition and modernity. But Prince William of Gloucester lived a tragically short life. Adventurous and well-liked, he died in a plane crash in 1972 at just 30 years old. His life, full of potential, ended in an instant. Meanwhile, Prince William, the modern one, continues to live out the arc his namesake never completed: marriage, children, and the impending weight of the crown. Then there's Princess Charlotte of Wales, 1796 to 1817, and Princess Charlotte of Cambridge, born 2015. Both royal daughters, both born with extraordinary public attention. Their shared name isn't the coincidence, it's the life expectancy. The first, Charlotte, died tragically in childbirth at age 21, plunging the nation into mourning. The second, still living, carries a name that feels like a cautious hope against history. Birthdays can be coincidences, or, in the royal realm, omens. And when it comes to celebrating life rather than mourning it, the monarchy has one favorite ritual: the Jubilee. Which brings us to the next mirror. Two queens, centuries apart, marking major jubilees on the same calendar date. 49. Jubilee twins, queens and their shared celebration date. The monarchy loves a party, especially when it's about its own survival. And among royal milestones, nothing says "still here" quite like a jubilee. These glittering anniversaries of a monarch's reign are rare by design, reserved for those who outlast wars, scandals, parliaments, and sometimes public opinion itself. But in two oddly symmetrical moments, two queens, separated by over a century, celebrated major jubilees on the same calendar date. Not just the same year marker, but the exact day. Let's begin with Queen Victoria and her Golden Jubilee, celebrated on June 21, 1887, the 50th anniversary of her accession to the throne. The event was imperial pageantry at its absolute peak. Emperors, kings, princes, and dignitaries from around the world gathered in London. Streets were decorated with banners. Crowds lined the mall. Victoria, often reclusive since Prince Albert's death, rode in an open carriage, swathed in symbolic weight and literal lace. Her jubilee was not just a personal triumph. It was a display of global British power, a reminder that the sun had not yet set on the empire. Now, fast forward to Queen Elizabeth II. Her silver jubilee in 1977 officially began in the early summer, but June 21st, the same day as Victoria's celebration, marked the climax of public festivities, including a massive royal procession and nationwide events. Once again, crowds lined the streets, but the tone had shifted. The empire was now a commonwealth, the Queen a symbol of continuity rather than expansion. Yet the date, deliberately chosen or not, created a quiet symmetry. Two queens, both female monarchs in an overwhelmingly male lineage, both ruling over times of transition, Victoria in the age of imperial dominance, Elizabeth in the twilight of colonial withdrawal. And both celebrated major reign milestones on June 21st, a date already loaded with symbolism. It's the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, a moment when light refuses to fade. Perhaps that's fitting for monarchs whose reigns defied the usual lifespan of power. The repetition invites curiosity. Was it a deliberate nod? A calendrical coincidence? A subtle callback in the scripting of royal myth? Whatever the case, the date now hums with echo. And so does the idea of reliance, not on celebrations, but on the figures behind the throne. Because the next strange alignment reveals two monarchs who leaned heavily on the same powerful family to help govern, even centuries apart. When bloodlines rule nations, sometimes the helpers outlast the kings themselves. 50. The power behind the crown. Dynastic advisors across time. Kings and queens wear the crown, but rarely do they rule alone. Every reign is underpinned by a constellation of advisors, confidants, and fixers, some of whom wield more power than the monarchs themselves. But what happens when two monarchs, living in completely different centuries, both rely on political heavyweights from the same family line? A subtle dynastic recurrence that suggests not just influence, but inherited proximity to power. Let's start with Robert Walpole, often credited as Britain's first de facto prime minister. A political survivor of unmatched skill, he guided the early reign of King George II during the 18th century. Walpole wasn't just a minister. He was the architect of modern British parliamentary governance, steering the ship while George II focused more on military campaigns and personal grievances. Under Walpole, the cabinet system solidified, the role of Parliament expanded, and the monarchy began its slow transformation from executive power to symbolic presence. Now fast forward to the 20th century. Another George. This time, George VI, a shy, reluctant king thrust into the role after Edward VIII's abdication. His reign was defined by World War II, national resilience, and the need for stabilizing leadership. And at his side, Winston Churchill, a descendant of the Spencer-Churchill lineage, a political dynasty that can trace ties, by marriage and blood, back to the very same elite circles that produced Walpole. Churchill, like Walpole, wasn't just a statesman. He was a symbol. A wartime orator, a strategic operator, and at times, more of a monarch than the monarch himself. His rapport with George VI was respectful but cautious. Both men knew their roles in the grand constitutional balancing act, one to reign, the other to rule. Two Georges, two leaders from the same extended aristocratic class navigating crises. And in both cases, the monarchy relied not on individual genius, but on families of influence, proving that in Britain, political dynasties don't need thrones to shape history. But while governance can be shared, symbols cannot. The next coincidence reveals something oddly ceremonial. Two monarchs, separated by centuries, who both presided over changes to the national symbols, altering the crown not in law, but in visual identity, and always in the same month. 51. Signs of the realm. Symbolic changes in the same month. If the crown is power, then the coat of arms, flags, and national symbols are its marketing department. Every sovereign knows, to reign is not just to rule, but to represent. And in two curious moments, monarchs across different eras both changed major national emblems, the visuals of British sovereignty, and did so in the same month. Not for show, for history. Begin with King James I. After the union of the crowns in 1603, he inherited both the English and Scottish thrones. To reflect this new dynastic reality, he altered the royal arms of England to include symbols of Scotland and Ireland, initiating the earliest version of a composite British coat of arms. This wasn't just heraldic tinkering, it was political messaging. James wanted unity. The visual language of monarchy had to follow suit. These changes were formalized in March 1603, just weeks after Elizabeth I's death. A springtime rebirth, or a rebranding depending on your perspective. Centuries later, in the same month of March, Queen Elizabeth II would preside over another subtle yet powerful visual shift. Following decolonization and the transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth, multiple national flags, including those of Canada, New Zealand, and several Caribbean nations, were formally altered or adopted. The British royal standard itself was revised in tone and deployment, used differently in Commonwealth nations, as the monarchy adapted to new diplomatic norms. Both moments marked profound constitutional changes disguised as design choices. The lion still roared. The unicorn still posed. But behind those mythical animals, the world was turning. That these two symbolic overhauls happened in March, a month of transition, of thaw and awakening, seems fitting. The monarchy, always a creature of ritual, changes even when it insists it hasn't. And the next pattern? Less symbolic, more surprising. Two royal siblings, centuries apart, whose fame came not from politics, but from their devotion to athleticism or military service. Royal blood, yes, but muscle and discipline were the real family tradition. 52. The soldier siblings, athletic and martial royals. Across the ages. For most royal siblings, history reserves one of two fates: to support the heir from the shadows, or to get caught in the orbit of scandal and exile. But sometimes, not often, but notably, a royal sibling steps out of courtly expectation and becomes known instead for their physical prowess, their military service, their sporting achievements, or their unapologetic dedication to something as unceremonial as sweat and strategy. And in at least two instances, separated by centuries, royal brothers, born of different monarchs and raised in different political worlds, became famous for doing just that. The first was Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, born in 1721, the youngest son of King George II. He didn't inherit the throne, but he did inherit war. Known as Butcher Cumberland to his critics and hero of Culloden to his supporters, William made his name as a military commander during the War of the Austrian Succession, and most famously at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the last pitched battle fought on British soil. His campaign ended the Jacobite uprising with decisive brutality, and while his legacy is controversial, his commitment to the army was not. He devoted his life to military affairs, never married, and never played the part of idle royal. Now shift to the modern royal family and meet Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Born in 1984 to Charles, Prince of Wales, later Charles III, Harry was second in line for most of his youth, the quintessential spare. But his public identity shifted dramatically when he enlisted in the British Army. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, trained as an Apache helicopter pilot, and earned respect not just as a royal in uniform, but as a soldier in his own right. Long before he stepped back from royal duties, his military career stood apart, as real, dangerous, and far from ceremonial. Both men were the younger sons. Both pursued active military careers. Both saw real combat. And both left behind carefully cultivated images of royalty. The idea that even a life born into castles can lead to trenches, barracks, and battlefield command. The parallel grows sharper when you consider public perception. Each man became, for a time, more relatable than his royal counterparts. The one who looked tired in uniform, who followed orders, who seemed unguarded by protocol. And while their ends differ, one died a bachelor general, the other became a California-based advocate and entrepreneur, they reflect a repeating truth, that sometimes the crown's most enduring strength comes from its margins, not its center. And while some royal siblings go to war, others simply go for walks, usually across historic ruins. Which leads us to our final coincidence. When 2 royals, generations apart, found themselves in the exact same obscure location, under radically different circumstances. One arrived as ruler, the other as outcast, same place. 2 stories, one uneasy echo. 53. The same stones. 2 royals, one obscure place. Places remember, especially the quiet ones, castles, manors, and windswept ruins that once housed ceremony but now host ghosts and tourists. And occasionally, these ancient stones play host to 2 royals, separated by centuries, who come to the same obscure location not by tradition, but by fate. Not in triumph, but in strangely mirrored circumstances, one as a reigning monarch, the other in retreat. Let's begin with Harlech Castle in North Wales, a fortress of grey stone, perched dramatically above the Irish Sea. It's not the most famous royal residence, but it holds deep historical weight. In the 15th century, during the Wars of the Roses, it became the final Lancastrian stronghold in England. Jasper Tudor, uncle to Henry VII, held it during a siege that came to symbolize loyalty in the face of collapse. Later, in the 19th century, Queen Victoria herself visited Harlech, not for war, but for ceremony. A monarch returning to a battlefield as a tourist. Now, centuries later, the same castle was quietly visited by Edward VIII, not as king, but as the Duke of Windsor, after his abdication. Official records barely mention the stop. It wasn't a royal tour. It was a personal detour, perhaps out of nostalgia, perhaps something harder to name. A moment where a once king stood among the walls that had once witnessed dynastic downfall. One royal visited in command, the other in exile. Both stared out at the same bleak sea. Another example is Craigmillar Castle, just outside Edinburgh, a favorite hunting retreat of Mary, Queen of Scots, and later, a curious stop on the private itinerary of Prince Charles, long before he became Charles III. In Mary's day, it was a sanctuary. For Charles, it was a heritage site. But both visits, formal and informal, were weighted by history. One queen hiding from political storms, one prince staring at stone and memory. In both stories, place became the constant. Royal fortunes shifted. The titles changed. But the castles remained, holding their breath for the next accidental echo. And that's what all of this has been. A mosaic of accidental echoes. Repeating names, dates, deeds, and disasters across centuries of British monarchy. 53 of them. All improbable, none impossible. Because when you trace royalty long enough, you stop seeing individuals and start seeing patterns. Patterns too strange to plan, too specific to ignore, too unresolved to explain.